Okay, we're at the University of New Orleans, and I'm part of the Pontchartrain Institute for Environmental Sciences. And what my lab does, the Nekton Research Lab, is look at organisms, mostly fishes, but we also look at shrimp and crabs, and we see how they interact in the estuarine habitats. In particular, I look at assemblages, which means the composition of the species, and we see how these change over space and time. So we can take data from the 50s, from the 70s, compare it to the data that we're collecting today, and see if there's been any changes, and if there are any changes, what are the things that are driving those changes.
Okay.
In the Nekton Research Lab, after the oil spill, we've gotten a few grants to look at the problems associated with that. Basically, our power is that we do have the baseline data. We know what the system looked like beforehand when it comes to shrimp, crabs, and fishes. So one of our grants from the National Science Foundation is to take those data and other data on fishes and crabs and shrimp, combine them with geological data from Dr. Mark Culp, who's also over here in the Pontchartrain Institute, bring them all together, have our database manager, Meg O'Connell, over the Pontchartrain Institute, combine them and working with undergraduate students, get them together. Then finally, there's a last step, and that we send all these data to Chris Jenkins up at the University of Colorado, and he makes these very large maps with coverages. So people, responders, can say, here are the habitats, here are the species, here are the substrates that may be impacted by the oil spill. When we're developing this database, we can also bring in other data beyond just the fishes and the geological stuff. The substrates themselves are very important, the consistency of them. This will be relevant in the future because we know that certain substrates will hold on to oil more than others. So as of today, we know there's oil in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. We don't know if it's going to stay there, if the next hurricane comes on in the next 5 or 10 years, will we be dealing with oil resurfacing again? We don't know what's going to hold on to the dispersants or what they're going to do with other substrates. So there are other data. Temperature will play a large role, salinity. All this goes into the chemistry of how the oil and the dispersants interact with the system and also interact with the organisms. For the NSF project, which involves building this big map, there is no new data involved. They want to know what was things going on before the oil spill. So we want to be able to give them the entire coverage so that other researchers who will be looking at this over the next few decades, unfortunately, will know what was here beforehand. There is a link between what we're doing with this new coverage and traditional collections in museum holdings, such as at the Tulane Museum. We know where these people collected their fishes. A lot of the time, though, federal agencies, state agencies, they don't have collections of organisms. So this will be a way of combining the stuff that we know are in the museum collections, what's going on, that people don't always hold on to the organisms, they don't hold on to them, but they identify them, they take environmental readings, and we can combine all of these that we can get our hands on. Well, with the NSF grant, it's a rapid response. It's in the definition, so we really are scrambling, and we're working on weekends, and our database manager and our students are trying to get this all collected very quickly to get the data up to Chris Jenkins in Colorado in the hopes that we can get this out there so there's some product at least by 2011 when the season starts again, and we can see what was going on in spring 2010 versus what's going to happen in spring 2011. Some of the other roles on the NSF project are bringing in undergraduates and graduate students and technicians to actually find data that are on the web. Go out there on the internet and find. What you find with researchers like myself, we'll get funding for, if we're lucky, 2 or 3 years at the most. We go out there, we collect the data we need, we write the papers, and that's the end of it. And these data often sit mostly unused in a cabinet or on a computer somewhere. What my students and my technicians are charged with doing is going out there and contacting these people or finding old research that's in a book somewhere and converting them to electronic format so they could be readily used. And that's the value for long-term analysis. It'd be nice as researchers that we could be out there and collect data and be paid for it for year upon year, but the fact is you have 2 or 3 years at a time and those data are published, and that's about it. And the way we're doing with the NSF grant, we hope to bring as much of that as possible to bear so we can use this and bring it into one area so everyone can use it. For the NSF rapid response, it is more of an emergency response. So most of my graduate students and undergraduate students were already on other grants. So they're being funded through this to do the actual work, but there are other projects that might be elsewhere. My hope is that this will lead into more long-term work where obviously they want the pre-oil spill data. Someone's going to have to collect the post-oil spill data, and we've gotten some funding for that, but we're hoping for more, and that will support some of my undergraduates and graduate students.
And so when you go out to collect your post-soil data, where are you collecting? And are you going to specific habitats? Are you going to all habitats? How are you doing that?
When we're doing our post-oil sampling, we're going back to all the historic sites that we've hit over the last 10 years. Our main bread and butter when it comes to research is Lake Pontchartrain itself. We've been out there since 2000 on a monthly basis doing work for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and we sample with 3 different gear types. We sample with beach seines, we sample with trawls, we sample with gill nets. So we go to our historic sites, we know what the situation there is for most of the species in Lake Pontchartrain. We also have long-term data at the Chandler Islands and in the Biloxi Marshes. We started that work in 2003. We go out there, and again, the type of analyses we do, we don't focus on one species. We collect all species that are out there and see what the composition of the assemblages are, just so we can assess how they change when we are faced with disasters. A good example is we looked at how Katrina affected fishes in Lake Pontchartrain and how the fishes at the Chandler Islands were affected by Katrina. Unfortunately, now we're going to have to be doing the same thing with the oil spill. And more particularly, more recently, we've been doing work with lemon sharks at the Chandler Islands. And based on the work of my operations manager, Chris Sheevely, he discovered that the Chandler Islands is the northernmost pupping ground or spawning area for this species on the planet. So here we were concerned about these islands being washed away by Katrina. Now we know they're especially important for the shark species. And while we were doing this work, and we had tagged fishes out there in 2009, we hoped to recapture them in 2010. The oil spill came along and put a big crimp in our research out there.
So I know that the Chandler Islands have been very harshly impacted by the oil spill. How about Lake Pontchartrain? What's been going on in Lake Pontchartrain with respect to oil?
When it comes to the oil spill in Lake Pontchartrain really dodged a bullet for most part. We had some oil coming into Lake Pontchartrain in early July, really didn't get farther than the eastern portion of the lake. But what people need to realize when it comes to Lake Pontchartrain is that up to 85% of the species in Lake Pontchartrain use habitats offshore. In other words, they don't live their whole life within Lake Pontchartrain. They have to go out in Lake Bourne or Chandler Sounds, complete their life cycles, whether they're shrimp, fishes, or blue crabs. So while the lake itself was not impacted by oil directly, the animals that go in there to complete their life cycles most likely have received some kind of impact.
So then that answers the question, how did those external sound areas in Chandler Islands and all that, how were they affected?
When it comes to more exterior portions of the estuary, Chandler Island, Chandler Sound, Biloxi Marshes, they received a lot of oil, not as much as the Barataria area, so we're lucky in that way. But the oil booming, and that also has its own impacts. I've had a crew working on lemon sharks at Chandler Islands. They were lucky enough to get out there in April, but due to a lot of legal issues and plans with safety, our research at the Chandler Islands in 2010 was delayed. We're trying to play catch-up now in the fall. But when they were out there, they would see the boom. They've seen tar balls of the Chandler Islands. They've seen areas of small fish kills. Admittedly, we've seen disasters like this before, but this is something that, yes, there have been impacts out there. We really don't know what the extent of their problems are right now. I think for people who are in Mississippi and southeast Louisiana, I think the main concerns from the oil spill is not so much that long-term impact. We obviously didn't get hit as badly as Barataria. There will be maybe some bioaccumulation, but we do have oil out there. And what I try to tell people is not to be panicked about seafood, but realize we've probably lost a lot of organisms this year. We've lost what they call a cohort. So maybe 4 or 5 years from now, when those small fishes should have been adults, we might not see as many blue crabs. We might not see as many brown shrimp. We may not see as many pogies. So we need to realize that this has been a bad year, and that will be transferred down the line. And it's not about bioaccumulation. It's that we've lost a year class of organisms. So 4 years from now, 8 years from now, if we see downturns, it may be attributed to oil. And again, I don't want to scare people about this. It's not something where you're going to be afraid. It's just that we're going to have fewer organisms out there, and perhaps we need to look for ways to mitigate that, perhaps improve the habitat, realizing that down the road we're going to be still feeling these effects. Yeah, it's different. People are more concerned about the bioaccumulation, and people need to realize there's direct toxicity. We've seen organisms that are killed directly. And people don't realize so many organisms are very small and microscopic. They're really the ones that have taken it on the chin when it comes to this oil spin. And it's very hard to go out and quantify that. We have a larval project going on looking at densities coming through the passes into Lake Pontchartrain, and we should be able to compare numbers next year. But people aren't concerned about that. They see fish kills and they're worried about issues like that. As for bioaccumulation, in a typical oil spill, less than 1% of what's in the oil is actually going to be able to bioaccumulate. That's the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Now, there's been a lot of oil out there, and that might be enough to actually see something down the line. But another thing people need to realize, at least with some of our key species in Mississippi and Louisiana, the blue crabs, the brown shrimp, they don't live that long. There's not a lot of opportunity to bioaccumulate stuff. They're not that high on the food chain. So even if they've been there 3 or 4 years to be a nice big juicy male blue crab, you're not going to have a lot of problems with oil unless there's direct oil on them or they have direct death mortality from the oil itself. I think if I was speaking with my fellow fish ecologists at a professional meeting, one of the first things I would bring up is, what are the long-term effects of this oil spill? And this comes from speaking and hearing about some of the scientists who work with the Exxon Valdez in Alaska, especially with their herring problem. And what the situation there was, this species was a commercial species doing fairly well. Right after the oil spill, a cohort came back. The next 3 or 4 years, everything seemed fine. But then later on, they stopped showing up, and then the problem started 4 or 5 years after the situation. And that's what we might be looking at here. We're not going to see an extirpation like we saw in Alaska. It's a different system altogether. But we have commercial species that have probably been impacted at the larval stage. They are not going to be around here in 4 or 5 years. We need to realize that. We need to kind of point out ways to mitigate that. And long-term effects, it's something that people don't want to study because it costs a lot of money to have long-term monitoring. But I think the government is willing to try to support this, to let us know what these actual impacts are. And again, people say oil out of sight, out of mind. This is something that's going to be long-term, unfortunately, here in Mississippi and in southeast Louisiana. I think a very relevant question is, how does the oil spill interact with the loss of marshes in Louisiana and in Mississippi? I think it plays a huge role. I think if we had proper restoration efforts in place decades ago, we would have had complete barrier islands like the Chandler Islands. We would have had complete marshes in the Biloxi marshes. And it's just the physical nature of things. You have more avenues for this oil to enter. So if we had complete marshes in the Biloxi marshes, yes, we still would have gotten damage, but so much of the interior marsh, which is very important for juvenile organisms to spawn, would still be intact. We probably would not have seen oil getting as far in as Lake Pontchartrain. It's just a matter of physics. If you had more physical boundaries between the oil and the interior marshes, we would have had less problems. Now, let me also say, though, that we need natural barriers. If you're throwing artificial barriers up there that will not be permanent, that are not held in place by plants and root systems, it's a waste of time. You need to support the natural restoration of the marshes and of the barrier islands. With the NSF grant, it's basically let's get as much data as we can all together in one place. What we have with researchers is that they tend to work on one thing. I just work with fishes, crabs, and shrimps. Dr. Mark Culp just works on looking at soil and geomorphology of barrier islands. What we want to do with this NSF grant is bring all these data together. Because often when we do this work, we don't realize that we collect stuff that's relevant to other people. So I might be collecting salinity data to look at what's going on with my fishes, but that's very relevant to the geologist, and vice versa. The geologist will look at, water flow pattern or the currents or what type of habitats are out there. That's very relevant as to where my fishes go. So the idea is to not only take our data, but get on the internet and look at other researchers and other data that's been done over the last few years and try to get it in one space. That's the main goal. We want the data in one place. So it's not like, I think someone did this over here or someone did this back then. We will know where all these data are and make the right decisions based on that. For this NSF grant, this is cutting edge stuff, and not to say that we're not involved, but we're basically the grunts on the ground who have the data and have been out there in the field. The work that Chris Jenkins does at the University of Colorado with his program D-Seabed, it's very cutting edge. The fact that they can actually bring these data together and make them work together. So often we have different sampling schemes, we measure different things. What his work does, the interesting part of this work, is to actually integrate that. And that's usually the problem. I've tried to bring in different fish databases from the 50s to the 70s to compare to our own data, and most of my time spent on those projects are trying to get the data to mesh together. Dr. Jenkins has a way to doing this automatically. It's a genius work, and it is something new for the public to help us deal with the oil spill. And one of the keys with the NSF grant, it is GIS reference. In other words, the whole basis that we know where these data are from. We know where we collected the fish. We know where that other researcher collected this core sample of sand. And you have to put that all meshed together based on their information, their geographic information, put in one system so you know that if this salinity is here in May in the year 2002, that's associated with this type of sand, that's associated with this type of fish. It all has to be GIS referenced. I think with the oil spill, and I'm being hopeful here, it has made researchers realize they have to work together. It made researchers realize the value of their work. It goes beyond just having a publication. And I'm guilty of this myself. I get a 2- or 3-year grant. I scramble to get the publication out, and then those data go to sleep, go someplace else. This is a way of recognizing the value not only of us in academia, but also the value of the people in the federal and state agencies who have these data, who are now actually newly, this is something new, federal agencies